Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, the podcast that looks at Bowen family systems theory ideas in brief and understandable ways. Today we're talking about Bowen theory and adolescence. And I'm so pleased that Avrum Nadigel is joining us again for another episode. Welcome back, Avrum.
Thank you for having me.
I'll start with your bio. Avrum has been a marriage and family therapist for 25 years and has completed postgraduate training in Bowen family systems theory. He's the author of 2 books on dating partnered relationships. No, I'm distinguishing them.
Okay.
2 books on dating partnered relationships called Learning to Commit and It Takes More Than Love, as well as a book for therapists called Where Would You Like to Start? A master therapist on beginning psychotherapy with families. Avrum has also co-produced 2 podcasts, Pop Parenting and the Love Examined playlist. And I thought for the purposes of this episode, it would be interesting to note that that all of us are currently parents to adolescents. And between the 3 of us, we have 7 kids between the ages of 8 and 22, not a fully developed prefrontal cortex to be found in there. So Avrum, welcome. How do you think Bowen theory is helpful for thinking about this stage of life?
Well, I'll tell you, when I first started my career, I worked in sort of child-focused clinics, and something that always, it was a conundrum. So kids would show up to therapy, usually either mandated through the school or their parents would drag them in. And successful therapy was kids showing up to each session. You thought you were doing pretty good work as a therapist. If a teenager showed up to every session, that's pretty good. But I noticed that the symptoms never changed. So they'd show up for therapy, but nothing ever changed. And I had a sense something was a bit off, but I had no other way of thinking about this. And then in my first book, I talked about how I met this guy named Dr. David Friedman, the late Dr. David Friedman from Vancouver, well-known family therapist. And in his book, I think it was called Multi-Generational Family Therapy, that was sitting on the shelf of our office. I was reading it bored one day. He essentially says, if you're working with teenagers, you should rarely be working with teenagers. You should be working with the parents. And I thought that was so weird. I've never heard of that before. But there was something about his argument that was very compelling. And so behind my supervisor's back, I would read one chapter at a time and I would introduce it into my sessions. And I started working differently, bringing in the parents, not the kids, because I thought whatever I'm doing isn't working or very well. It was unbelievable to me when I started thinking from a systems lens, which Freeman was trained on, how I'd be working with the parents. And once the focus shifted away from the kids, but to the leadership level and usually it was a marital thing, but it might not. It could be like a chronic illness in a grandparent or a family business falling apart. The symptoms in the teens would go down. And what was fascinating to me was many years later, I would get calls, sometimes from the kid, but usually the parents, and they would say, we just want to thank you so much for the work you did with our teen, because now they're in university. And I rarely saw the teen. So even my old clients thought of all this work I did with their kid, which was rarely the case. That for me was sort of a very eye-opening way of thinking very, very differently about how to manage whatever turbulence was going on in a young person's life.
So your pitch would be managing adolescence begins with talking to parents?
Oh, no, that's not my pitch.
No.
I got my pitch, Dixie.
Okay, do your pitch.
I was answering question 2. No, my pitch, we're going to have to go back to 1985, the Breakfast Club. And this is where the 5 kids have a detention. And the teacher says, you have to write an essay. And the essay is, who are you? I think that's what he said. Who are you? And Brian the nerd, who was that? Michael Anthony Hall? Was that who played? Put a pen on his lip. And while he's inserting the pen into his nostril, he keeps repeating the question, who am I? Who am I? And I thought to myself, that one question not just captures the task of adolescence, which is, you're moving from, you're under the umbrella or the yoke of your parental expectations as a kid, but you're trying to figure out, what do I believe? What do I think? What are my interests separate from my family? But also, what might I borrow from my family?
Mm-hmm.
That task of trying to figure that out, for me, is differentiation in action. And I just think adolescence is the time when it really sort of comes to the fore. Young adulthood too, but definitely adolescence. So that scene, who am I? That's my elevator pitch.
Oh, I like
Great.
it. I like it. It's going to be related to mine. I've been making efforts to kind of pick a concept and think about it. So I have been thinking a lot about individuality and togetherness. So people might get sick of me talking about this season, but I think, kind of related to what Avrum was saying, I think these adolescent years are a time where the move is naturally pulled towards more autonomy from the family. Um, and I imagine I was thinking about this, it has to have some component of evolutionary, puberty's coming on. We want to move to create new families. And it probably makes sense to take some move away from the family and forge new connections outside of that family. And I think it shows up, like Avram said, in teens trying to figure out, who am I? Where do I belong? Who do I relate to? How do I get connected? But I think it's important to think about the multi-generational process as we're thinking about individuality and togetherness. So the curiosity of, if parents are more solid in their thinking about themselves in this time period, I imagine the adolescent launches through this period a little more solid. If they have some feelings about how they think about this period, I think that parents can create more space than others who are really, really anxious about this time period of adolescence. So looking at kind of that individuality and togetherness happening at multi-generationally, like, we want to pull this kid in and not let them get out of our family, or do we give them the space to say, they're figuring themselves out. I want them to go out and explore and think about that and come back. And I'm going to be clear with you about, the gift of a parent who can say, I can be clear with you about what I believe. Or you're bringing this idea to the family. Here's how I might think differently. So, that both the solidness in the parent and that just the forces that are constantly going on in that emotional system for individuality and togetherness. So that is my long-winded, as usual, pitch. Dixie.
Mine is, I didn't have one concept. I just thought, let's talk about all of them. So I see adolescence as a time when a person's world and their understanding of the world expands. And I think it's a time that all 8 of the concepts of Bowen theory might show up more intensely. So triangles between family and friends, one child getting more parental focus or being seen as the problem, emotional cutoff can start between generations, distance, conflict over and under functioning can shift or become more intense. And even like just at the biological level, the concept of differentiation of self as the brain develops more reasoning, big picture thinking capacity. And then one goes from being a dependent to physiologically being able to create your own dependence, just that process. So it's a big biopsychosocial shift for both parents and teens, and everyone contributes to how intensely this gets lived out. Okay, I have a couple more pitches. We have a letter from the Murray Bowen Archives Project from 1970. Dr. Bowen says, "The absolute smartest I ever was in my entire life was the year I graduated from high school. I couldn't convince others that I had all the answers, but I secretly knew it." And later in that letter, he says, "Since then, I've been getting stupider and stupider every year. The more I learn, the more I find I do not know." Which, very
so
Socratic
great.
there. Yeah. There was a Family Matters, which is from the Bowen Center, an episode, which I'll link to, called Surviving the Teen Years with Kathleen Kerr. And she talks about the resources of having 2 parents who are different people. For the child to have the opportunity to relate to 2 different people and figure out that not everybody's the same and that people can have differences, that's a resource. As opposed to one thing parents do is try to act like they're one person. And then the child really doesn't get the experience of relating to 2 different people, learning about different styles, different ways of being, different ways of responding, which I thought was so interesting because I don't like it when my husband and I see things differently, but it's actually a resource to kids. And then, I mean, you guys have sort of said it before, but I just wanted to know that ChatGPT does agree with you, because this, which is very important, I think, right? Because this morning I just punched in describe every coming of age teen movie. And this is what it said. Coming of age teen movies typically follow a protagonist's journey from adolescence to adulthood, often focusing on themes of self-discovery, personal growth, and navigating societal expectations. They highlight struggles with identity, family relationships, and first experiences with romance or social situation. The protagonist usually undergoes a significant change, both emotionally and mentally, as they learn to deal with challenges and make choices that shape their future. Okay, pitches, done.
You know what's so interesting about that last one is I really appreciate that adolescence can be a time where you can choose your own adventure and try out different adventures, try out different identities if there is a tolerance. I'm coming back to like that individuality and togetherness or distance. How much distance do we allow in our own system and relationships? Can a kid try on, do I want to be a sporty person? Do I, how much does that fit with my identity? Do I want to, hang out and learn these things? Do I want to take some risks and see what that's like? I think it's interesting that is something that is useful to think with families about it. Because I think sometimes adolescents get under pressure where they have to. And I don't know what the influence of, I always say I was a child of the 80s and 90s. So I had some more freedom where other people weren't always weighing in the outside world, weren't weighing in on how I thought about myself. I mean, some in my internal world were, but at least I didn't have the internet telling me how to think. And I wonder if that takes away some of that freedom or it enhances it. I mean, that would be a curiosity.
One of the things, Dixie, you said, I think it was you, Dixie, or I don't know, someone said solid self within parents and how that plays itself out. Because, there's this myth, right? There's a lot of myths. When people meet my wife and I'm like, oh, you're both therapists, your kids must be really screwed up. We actually have great kids, and I think I don't think it was wrong. I think back in the day when you had two psychoanalysts, maybe two Freudians married. Yeah, maybe. But I mean, generally, I think there's these myths. And the other myth is that adolescence is crazy. It's like everything is crazy. And I just don't find that is absolutely false. And I think it has to do with, to a certain degree, the solidity of the parents, together or divorced, by the way. I mean,
yes.
I just think the solidity of how they were together, look, my wife and I have our challenges, but one of the areas I think that we've done a pretty good job in is music. So my wife grew up on Suzuki violin. She knew right from the get-go when we were dating that if we have kids, I want them to do Suzuki. I'm a rock guitarist, self-taught. I can't read a note. I could care less. I actually think it gets in the way of creativity. But one of the things I learned in systems theory is if you can get to a point of, I don't have to love it in a marriage, but so long as it's not violating my principles and I can live with it, you can have a great marriage and a great family. And so I was like, you know what? You want to raise the kids on Suzuki? Great. What I've noticed in all three of my kids is they see me in my basement futzing around with software and guitar effects and stuff. They all have a base of Suzuki, but all three of them now are starting to sort of drift as they're getting older. They all have a base of music, but my 8-year-old is playing with the iPad and doing stuff in GarageBand. My middle wants to learn guitar. And my third isn't more involved in a classical sort of musical thing in his high school. And I think that because my wife and I are both solid in our own little musical ways, that we're not projecting anything onto our kids, it allows them to explore musically what they want. So they got the foundational part, but they're allowed to, I think, differentiate as musicians in their own way. And that's where theory really has been helpful in that one little area.
Yeah, the parents don't get anxious for this is how it has to be.
Yeah.
Like you have to do this. And I was thinking about, that was one of my examples that I thought about, is where you watch the intensity of the parent. Or I see it a lot in sports, where the parent will want the kid to be this thing. And I'm sitting on the sidelines of something. I'm like, your kid ain't going to be David Beckham. Like this, maybe, but is that your dream? And what is their dream? Where are they interested? What do they get curious about? So that was what came to me.
Yeah. At age 13, I switched from 4 years of Suzuki violin to playing the drums. And my parents allowed me that decision, or there was that flexibility. And sports, music, other hobbies, who who's driving that. And
Yeah.
I think it can be a balance, because often you have the kids that quit piano lessons because they hated it and then wish their parents had kept them in.
Blame your parents. There we go, the adolescent.
Right?
The other thing I thought was so useful that I heard in all of our pitches and some of the ones that you raised, Dixie, is that this developmental process. This is a stage of life that people are working to figure things out. And there is a beginning probably and a place, hopefully, where they launch into adulthood and begin to continue on that pathway. So taking that stadium view of not getting caught, which I think adolescents can get so caught without that full frontal lobe development in the moment or in the one relationship. And I think the resource of a parent who does have that fully developed frontal lobe hopefully can be to sit with them and have a little bit more of that stadium view.
Yeah. Well, more examples. Avrum, do you have even more movie examples?
Well, you know what? I can go through all of John Hughes' catalog, and one of the things that I wanted to just think about in terms of also how the projection process can play itself out, sort of in a multi-generational way. When I first started training, I was a high school guidance counselor, and I was in a Jewish day school in Montreal, and I got referred a kid, very depressed young boy, teenager, 15 years old, something like that. Wanted to be a pilot. Parents, I'm going to change some of the facts here. Let's say they were lawyers. So they were both lawyers. I met the parents, lovely people. They weren't angry with their kid. They really loved their kid, but in a very sort of quiet way. They would sit there and they would say, he's not going to become a pilot. He's going to go. And so my first reaction, my countertransference anyways, was I really don't like these people because your kid wants, you should support your, we get caught up in the triangle too as therapists. And this is way before I knew about systems theory. And you could just see the kid sort of shrinking in his seat because it really was a lovely family. You could see he wasn't going to violate his parents' wishes. When we went back a generation, and again, I wasn't thinking systems. I was just thinking like, how did you become a lawyer in this? Well, the Holocaust, family on both sides of the mother and father were lost during the Holocaust. And so there was this feeling of you go to school, you get your master's, you either go into medicine, law, or business, and you build your ghetto walls and you insulate yourself because this could happen again. Now, this kid doesn't know from that. All he's getting is the fumes of a trauma that happened a long time ago. And the parents were projecting it as love because they never said, we're doing this because we're scared the Cossacks are going to come back from Russia and come through Montreal. But there was this unconscious real fear that if you go into whatever you want to study and it's not going to be a predictable career or something that's going to maintain a certain lifestyle, you're at risk. And so there is this primordial need to save my kid in a way. And the kid is like fighting, like I need to be my own person. But because this kid is interesting, didn't have enough self, because he really was just like, a go along to get along kind of a kid. It manifests itself in the symptom of depression and never saw them again. So I don't have a happy ending to this. I don't know what happened with this family.
What an interesting way to talk about, Avrum, the different ways. I think chronic anxiety is what you're talking about, that feeling, that intensity that might get passed down in the family. And I really appreciate, because I think when we give examples of chronic anxiety, it's often like the anxious negative thing versus, looking at, we love this kid, we want the best for him. That can be a way that it can also show up.
And it's not the circumstances of the family, it is the process. Because I think you can have that in affluent families or families that have experienced, poverty. Which I think is helpful to think through too.
I was thinking about my examples were maybe what would the adolescent be up against? How would I use theory to think about them? And when I first started as a counselor, it's always funny where they put people when they first started. I was also sitting with adolescents in this program that was drug court, they called it. So it was kids who had been caught doing drugs, charged with a crime. They were enrolled in this program where they got drug tested once a week, went before a judge, I think every other week, and they would get group therapy as part of it. The parents weren't involved, is interesting. But one of the things that I found interesting that was prominent in this group was this cost of being a self in adolescence. The challenge of being a solid self in a group. And I wanted to bring that up as example, like that an adolescent really feels a cost to saying no when all their friends are doing a drug and to be the kid who says no. And and I think that's worthy to talk about through the lens of theory, that the challenge of holding on to self, because adults could relate to that. You would know. There's a lot on drinking and not drinking, and what is it like to go to a party and say, I don't want to have a drink, and everyone's like, oh my goodness, why? Right? even as adults, we're still doing this. So just this discomfort that can exist with a kid, and who is the resources in their system to think about that with them? Who is the person that can support them in their decisions to potentially do something different, even if it has a cost to them, right? If their friend says, you can't hang out with us anymore if you're not going to take on this thing. And I don't think it's that overt sometimes. But I think there is such a challenge to hold on to a solid self for some kids.
And Katie, I think it comes back to something we just spoke about before, which is that if you grew up in a family where you have two parents, let's assume there's two parents, you have two parents, and through osmosis, you experience these two people who are able to live together and love together and all this, but they're able to hold different thinking on things, right? You will learn that you can coexist with different thinking when you get older. But if you grew up in a family where everyone pulls for, love is, we all agree on the same thing, or peace at all costs.
Right.
I don't care how much therapy you're going to give this kid, or CBT or mindfulness. You've absorbed the lesson that you go with the group. And then I guess you hope through trial and error, and maybe reading one of the family systems books, or a course of living systems, that you can learn as an adult to the very difficult work of differentiating a self. But I really think that those of us who are blessed, I was not. I grew up closer to the family where my parents pushed for peace at all costs. So it was a lot of work for me, and it'll be my job the rest of my life to differentiate a self and my thinking, separate from my wife, separate from my community, separate from my colleagues. At times, Katie and Dixie, we've talked about that. In the family systems world, there is a sort of sometimes a groupthink, even the way people talk, the verbs they use, the adjectives they use, and so how do you maintain your thinking in the force of that? If you grow up in a family where you have those kind of parents, it just makes everything a lot easier.
I think that's such a good point. And so I was thinking about, what is a suggestion that you give parents to work on this, to think through this? I think differentiation is such a complicated term, but if you were to say in simple words, how does a parent learn to tolerate some difference?
Katie, one of the things that I'm thinking of, I don't know about you guys, as a therapist, I tend to recycle certain catechisms or phrases just because they're sticky and they work personally and professionally. And one of them is something I just mentioned before, teaching my clients who come in where they think that love is a certain way. So they have a texture of love. And one version of that, I think, is that when you love someone, you agree with them or you support them. That's a big thing in our out there in the world, right? If you love someone, you support them, even if you don't agree. Now, we, at least in our world, at least from a systems thinking, that's not love, that's fusion, right? And so what I teach people is, and I'll use metaphors of music. Any professional musician can go blah, 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 like on the violin or the guitar, but it's the space between the notes that creates the melody. Now, people get that. They understand that concept. And so what I'll say is, you don't got to love every decision, but if you can get to that, I can live with the decision, right? You can have a wonderful life. And I think people intuitively know that because they live it out in the real world. And so, and then we can talk in practice, but how does that work if my partner wants this or my kid wants this? Then you actually funnel down to principles. Well, what are your principles around that thing? And what's fascinating is people just don't think about that or never have. I'll have clients say to me, I don't know, like, what do you mean? What do I think about drinking and or drugs or
Yeah.
interfaith relationships, or I don't know. This is what my family's always thought, or this is the church we've always went to. I don't know. I was like, well, yeah, and then I'll make a joke. I'll say, well, not a bad time to start thinking. And they get that. They get that. And then, that I'll say, your kid is a good catalyst for some growth here, to sort of think about this. So that's just something I've used, and it seems to have an effect on quite a few people.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think you're giving them some language to have some space. And the other part, I think that the space part is the useful thing to tell people. I mean, there are some situations where there's urgency, right? I do think, I don't want to deny that there are situations where an urgent decision, an urgent action needs to happen. But I think, myself included, we often think that happens way more than it probably does. Mm-hmm. So just even to name that you can take some space to think about it. You can say to your child, husband, coworker, boss, I need to think about that, and then I'll come back to you. Now, the key I always joke about is you do have to come back. That is the work of differentiation, right? How do I think about what I believe here, and then how do I communicate that to people I'm in a relationship with? But I always think that is a gift to remind people about that. They can take some space, and do you take some space to think about, or do you wait till the moment when the thing happens and then feel you have to, tell people how you think about it right then and there?
Can I quickly give you my example to relive some teenage some teenage fears? Katie and I were texting the other day because I was editing the podcast, and she was commenting because I was editing late, and I said, I love editing. It does not feel like work to me. It feels like joy. And Katie's response was, and this is where we part on our definition of fun. And so here's what came to my brain last night. Did I have none of the fun of adolescence and all of the insecurity? Like, that's kind of what I wondered, because I mean, in grade 9, I stayed up till 2 a.m. The day that we started algebra, I loved it. And I just went through the textbook. I just went through and did all the things on Friday night until I got to a question at 2 a.m. that I couldn't do. And then I was in tears and crying. And I was 3/4 of the way through the course in one night. But I never went to camp growing up. And I thought it was activities, public washrooms. I don't need to play games. I want to learn, And so very recently I got asked if I would be a camp counselor, because they needed female counselors at our church camp. And this is my camp response. I'm like, bathrooms, people, activities, lack of sleep. But I thought, is that my automatic? What if I think this through? It's just been wired in me for 30 years that I do not like camp. And so I'm going. I said yes. But I just wondered if I'm thinking through, is my definition of fun, am I just like authentically Dixie, who loves editing and who loves nonfiction or documentaries or things like that? Or have I just been afraid of more social situations? And I think it can be both, but it's going to be my experiment the first week of July to see where I can find fun.
There you go.
Well, Dixie, this is the issue you're raising actually is something that doesn't get spoken about enough, I think, in our world. It's very not easy, but to sit here and contemplate over an Americano in a coffee shop, differentiation of self and principles, and you write them down in a notebook, and you close it, you get on your bike, you go home. It's like, I figured it out. But I don't find that works very well for me, because it's too incestuous. I'll sit there with my fears and my anxieties, assume that that's what I don't want to do, kind of like what you were saying. But as I've matured, I'm realizing some of the things I'm scared about are actually things that are very good for me, but that I've developed an allergy for whatever reason. And just a quick example is when I travel, I get very anxious. I don't like traveling. I don't like it. And yet it's always the best experience for me. I come back from traveling and I discover, whoa, I'm really into mountains. I grew up in Montreal. There were no mountains when I went to bed, but I hated the first week. I went to Israel for 3 weeks when I was like maybe my mid to late 20s. And I remember, I can't believe I'm going to say this. I was older, calling my mom saying, I can't sleep and I'm going to go crazy in the Middle East. The best vacation, and I discovered things. So Katie, it's a very important point. I think you're saying this idea of exploration of self and what we think. I think we need to get out of whatever trappings we have ourselves in and explore in a way that cannot happen, I think, in a therapist's office or in a coffee shop. We have to somehow challenge ourselves to explore and experience things, and then observe and see. But it's just, I don't find it's spoken enough about.
Yeah, and I think it probably has a lot to do with the tolerance of the parent to that behavior. If you're thinking it from an adolescent context, I always say a gift that I had when I was an adolescent, although I will joke with everyone listening before this call, I said I would not want to go back to my adolescence. But I think a gift that my parents gave me is I could play around in different groups. Like I played a sport, so I got to have that experience. I was in advanced classes because I definitely have a very strong nerd in me that really likes to think through things. I also got in a bit of trouble. So I could drift into different, I always say that's part of the reasons I ended up in the therapist chair. I got really interested in how families who were different than mine manage things, and so I think that there was something in my parents that kind of, I don't know, they must have encouraged it or supported it. And I got in trouble. They were not pleased with some of my behavior. But I think that I get interested, and I thank them regularly that I think there was this sort of tolerance and encouragement. Now, they also had their own interests, which I think is something we haven't talked about in this podcast to this point with adolescence, is I do think there is something to parents having their own lives. Well, throughout all of the raising, they had their own interests, and I was appreciative of them having careers that they were interested in, or hobbies that really let them also work at defining to me, not out loud, but communicating to me through their behavior that there was something that was important to them. And I think that's I think I lost my train of thought, but I was going somewhere there with that.
Katie, you're raising a very, very important point, and I don't know when I came to it, but it probably was something I experienced as a kid. I grew up in a family where the idea was that if you don't know and you haven't figured out what you're going to do by the time, let's say you're 22, 23, you're screwed. You're screwed. So when you have kids, make sure you give them the tools. But I never found it work, because what happens is kids would look at their parents and go, I got it. Like there's this rush to figure it all out, because I could end up like them, like my parents, who serve as a warning sign to me. And then I discover something. The woman who goes back to do her PhD at 65, the guy who leaves his career. And I remember I would get intoxicated with these career change or vocational change stories. And then I thought to myself, there's just not enough of them out there. And so I really have tried I don't tell my kids this, but they can see it, how I'll hire a tutor to learn Logic Pro on the MacBook. I'll hire a tutor to get better at this. I want them to see, but I'm doing this for me. I mean, it's selfish. It's for me. But I think it does have an impact on my kids that, I'm 56. I will be a lifelong learner for the rest of my life. I want them to know that at any point in your life, you can switch, keep going, and you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But that starts at the leadership level. That you have to experience. And I think a lot of families, there's just this feeling of, if you haven't figured out your career or whatever the thing is by X date, just make sure your kids don't end up like that.
Yeah, that
it's a
anxiety,
lot of pressure.
principles.
It's a lot of anxiety.
Yeah. And there's so much focus on couples finding their joint hobbies and the things that they enjoy doing together, which I think is important. And like you're describing, Avrum, with your instruments, and for kids to see differences and how that is also a resource.
That is my takeaway. Is I'm borrowing from Jenny Brown, who's done a lot of thinking about adolescence, is how do you give your children the growing up space to think through their own beliefs and principles while staying connected to them? And I would also send that, if by chance there's some adolescent listening to this podcast, I would also send that challenge out to the adolescent. Like, how do you give yourself space? And I think the great thing about adolescence is the playground to think through, what do you believe? How much does what your parents believe align with your thinking? How much does it not? I mean, if you want to take up some time to think about that and think through it, I think that's a useful exercise. So those are that's my takeaway statement.
Yeah. Do you have one, Avrum?
Two brief ones. I think Ron Richardson's book, Family Ties That Bind, in particular, first, he has such a lovely way of taking complicated ideas and writing about them in a way I think that just resonates with people. But the mobile idea where he says, he tries to explain chronic anxiety, or anxiety is, when you have a mobile hanging from the ceiling, the air, you don't see the air, but you can see the mobile move, and all of it moves. How he describes that anxiety moves through a family. So if your teen is acting out in some way, it usually is the canary in the coal mine of what's going on in the family. That mobile idea just works. And the other one is just a question that I ask myself, but I will say this in different ways to my clients, something like, are you seeing the kid that you need or the kid that you have?
Yeah. That's a great question.
My takeaways were Dan Siegel wrote a book called Brainstorm, I think The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, which is all about the neurobiology of this development. And he talks about sort of the 4 big developments that are going on in kids. So I recommend that. And then Kathleen Smith's book, True to You. In it, she has a part that talks about external comparison versus internal compass, immediate problem versus an opportunity for maturity, anxious attention or thoughtful attention. I thought that is a great resource for people. All right. Thanks for being with us again, Avrum.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I hope people take away, 1 or 20 ideas of what they can begin to observe. Think about their own teenage years and the teens that they're living with, that it's helpful as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.